My name is Flavio Toxmer. I'm at the University of Cambridge, and I'm going to be talking about rational epidemic theory and game theoretical models. So before I start, I'd like to thank the organizers for including me and giving me the opportunity to talk about the literature that I've contributed to and which other of the organizers have also worked in a number of years. And I think it's vitally important that people like epidemiologists and economists and other people get together and work in this important interdisciplinary field. As I will hope to make clear during my talk, I believe that economists have things to contribute, and I would like to outline what are the areas that I believe we can make most use of our tools. Now, just to set the stage, epidemiology and public health, of course, as disciplines grew out of the natural sciences, of medical science, and of biology in particular. But policy has always been in the background of many epidemiologists' work. And just to give an example, this is a quote from a textbook on mathematical epidemiology that says that one of the purposes of modeling epidemics is to provide rational basis for policies to control the spread of disease. So epidemiologists are not only interested in understanding epidemics as a purely scientific endeavor, although that of course is also important, but also we want to understand, use that knowledge and to form the basis of policy work in this area. Now, what I call traditional epidemic modeling and public health analysis has had two peculiarities which economists believe that they can address. And the first one is that it makes little use of explicit optimization in policy design. So typically, or many studies in epidemiology, and I will give an example later in this talk, will indeed look at a few different policies and maybe discuss the pros and cons, but they don't embark on a systematic search for what would be sort of the optimal policy. And second, many of these analyses don't integrate behavior into the modeling itself. Behavior is, of course, considered, but in a somewhat non-integrated manner. It is something that is considered after the modeling, in some sense, has been completed. And these two particular issues make epidemiology and public health, in some sense, very close to social sciences, because it touches upon some issues that many social scientists, of course, are also interested in, such as behavior and interaction between individuals. And economic epidemiology as a subdiscipline seeks to fill exactly these two gaps. Now, modeling has, of course, always been important, both in economics and in epidemiology, but perhaps they matter more than ever in these times. Now, models have served two main purposes. First, they help inform the public by telling the public what could happen if we don't do this or that policy. And also, they directly, of course, influence the design of policy itself. And in March of last year, there was a very influential study published by Imperial College London that was led by Professor Ferguson. And I think it's not an overstatement to say that this report probably had more influence than any other academic study in recent memory. And this is just a headline for the Financial Times at the time, that this report shocked governments and pushed them into action. So it indeed influenced and changed policy both in the UK and the US, but also subsequently around the world. So these studies are important. So let's try to dig a bit deeper and see what exactly this study did. So what it did is that it built a model of the epidemic, and they used that model to make different projections about things that could happen under different scenarios. And in particular, what they did is they built so-called reasonable worst-case scenarios. And here in this graph, I show you, this is taken from the report. Here you can see the number of deaths per day in the US and in the UK, under the assumption that there is no policy intervention and that there's no spontaneous behavior in the population. As you can see, these are frightening numbers. In fact, based on this scenario, the authors projected that there might be as many as 500,000 people dead in the UK alone and more than 2 million people in the US. Now, this model is entirely non-behavioral, and it is calibrated to the US and the UK populations, of course, with the knowledge that was available about the disease at the time. The next thing that this study went on to do was to look at different possible policy interventions and to see how those policy interventions would then influence the evolution of the disease. So here we have, again, the benchmark case is the so-called reasonable worst case scenario. That's the black line, and this is now critical care beds occupied per 100,000 of population. And then we can see for the different policies that the authors have considered, what would be the likely evolution over time. And we can see there's a whole range of different options depending on the kind of interventions that have been put in place. Now, the important thing is that in all these different projections, behavior is assumed, it is not derived. In other words, the authors have said, well, suppose that people do this, then what will be the consequences? Okay, and just to give you an idea of what that looked like, let's take the penultimate policy, social distancing of the entire population, and there the assumption is that that all households reduce the contact outside of the household by 75% and so on and so forth. So these are basically assumptions. We don't know whether in actual practical terms, 75% is a high estimate or a low estimate. In fact, it's not even an estimate. It's just really just an assumption. We don't know whether if a social distancing policy was were to be encouraged, whether 90% or 10% would actually play along and do as they're being encouraged to behave. So this is how behavior is typically treated in these types of models. And the last thing they also did is they looked at radically different kinds of policies. In this case is a policy of switching on and switching off the lockdowns as the disease spikes over time. This looks a little bit like what was actually implemented in the UK, of course, under a very different time scale, because these spikes, of course, happen over months rather, or very, very short intervals, rather than the longer intervals that we've seen in practice. Now, the question arises is that are these policies preferable to other policies? Okay, so we have now a whole menu of different policies, and we want to know, well, which one is the best policy? Which one should we recommend? In order to do that, of course, we first have to formulate a criterion to make to be able to rank these different policy alternatives. And then the question becomes, what is the right criterion? Is it lives saved? Is it least economic cost? Or is it some combination of the two? Okay. So now, having set the stage, let's talk a little bit about economic epidemiology. What are the two types of fundamental issues that economists have with this type of analysis? Well, the first one is to do with behavior. And so let's ask the question, what is really the realistic worst case scenario? Is it realistic that if we don't do any policy intervention, then people will actually not change their behavior? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to understand behavior. That is, we have to have a theory of how people actually behave in the face of an epidemic. And the purely mechanistic approach that is inherent in the mathematical epidemiology literature is simply not equipped to answer that kind of questions. And the second question that I've alluded to already is, what is the best set of policies? In order to do that, of course, we need to do an explicit cost-benefit analysis. That is, we have to see what are the pros and cons of each of the different policies. And then we need, of course, the objective that we have formulated in order to be able to rank these different policies. Now, for carrying out the first kind of analysis, that behavioral analysis, the tools that economists use are game theory and equilibrium analysis. And for the second kind of analysis, typically what we use is some kind of dynamic optimization techniques, typically optimal control theory or dynamic programming. And once we have those tools in place, we can then design policies that are good in the sense that they bring us closer to socially desirable outcomes. Okay, and this is exactly where economists come in. Now, I don't want to give the impression that for example, the Ferguson group, that they don't know what they're doing. They, of course, know very well what they're doing, and they also understand the drawback of their own analysis. In their results section, they preface everything by saying that in the unlikely absence of any control measures or spontaneous changes in behavior, then so on and so forth. So they explicitly tell us that they understand that assuming that there's going to be no behavior at all is actually not a very good scenario, which makes you wonder, of course, why it has been called the reasonable worst case scenario. Okay, so even though they recognize this potential pitfall, they until very recently have not gone very far in actually incorporating behavioral considerations into the analysis. Now, lest anyone think that behavior is really not a big deal, let me just remind you, this is Google mobility reports of the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, and this shows basically how people's behavior patterns changed with the onset of the COVID-19 epidemic. And you can see from the first few graphs that around the first week of May, there was a sharp decrease in all activities that involved exposure to the infection. Now, the thing about Denmark is that they actually had formal lockdown measures. And so let's just very briefly look at Sweden. This is Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. And we can see that even though the Swedish government imposed much fewer restrictions, similar behavior patterns were evident in the Swedish capital. And so even though the magnitudes are different, and this is something we'll come back to later, even though the magnitudes of the behavior changes were different, the overall pattern of behavior is very similar, whether or not formal lockdowns were actually imposed. Okay, now to study a fully integrated economic epidemiological model, we need knowledge of two blocks, as it were. On the one hand, we need to understand the biology, and this is something that we will have to take from the epidemiologists and from the medical scientists. That is, what are the properties of the disease and the possible interventions? What is the mode of transmission, the severity, which are the groups that are at risk? What do we have at our disposal to combat the disease, therapeutics, vaccines, and so on? Now, on the other hand, we need to understand, of course, behavior. And this is where economists come in, because behavior is basically about choices, and choices is what economists do. So, for example, what are individuals' incentives to use condoms, to vaccinate themselves, to self-isolate, or to engage in social distancing, testing, and so on and so forth? Now, economists have a well-developed methodology to analyze this kind of interactions between the environment in which the individuals find themselves and the decisions that they make. And in this context, I want to emphasize an important thing, which is so-called micro-macro interactions. So to get a fully fledged analysis of an epidemic that includes behavior, we need to understand two levels of analysis. At the macroscopic level, we can think of aggregate disease dynamics. So that will typically be described by the standard compartmental models developed in mathematical epidemiology. That is your standard SIS, SIRS, SI models, depending on the infectious disease under consideration. Now, these aggregate dynamics, of course, they describe in a very aggregated way what happens at the microscopic level. That is, what happens with individuals who, of course, in our model will be making decisions. So at the microscopic level, what we want to do is we want to understand individual behavior by people, okay? And in order to understand that, we need to talk about preferences, we need to talk about constraints, possible strategies, what information individuals have about the disease or about disease prevalence, whether they behave strategically towards others, and so on. And this we can encapsulate it in the idea of the trade-off, that is, different courses of action have different costs and benefits for the individual, and therefore they will influence, of course, what they do. So there's going to be an interaction between trade-offs at the micro level and the aggregate disease dynamics at the macroscopic level. And the interaction between those two levels can be encapsulated by those two bullet points. The aggregate dynamics in the population, that is how many people are infected, how many people have recovered, and so on, changes the risks faced by individuals. Therefore, it changes the trade-offs, which in turn changes their behavior. But individual behavior, once you aggregate across the entire population, make up the aggregate dynamics. And so there's a feedback loop between, on the one hand, the macroscopic level and the microscopic level, and understanding these feedback loops really is important for understanding how the disease is likely to evolve over time, but is also important in order to design optimal policy, because what policy does is that it modulates the trade-offs that each individual faces, and therefore it will also feed through aggregation to the aggregate disease dynamics at the macroscopic level. Okay, so one can of course write that up here in a graph. At the aggregate level, we have the disease dynamics that change the influence the trade-offs of individuals. Therefore, it changes their decisions, which in turn influences incidence and prevalence, and then it feeds back to aggregate dynamics. Policy interventions, as I mentioned, influence the trade-offs directly. They don't typically intervene directly at the aggregate level, although that is sometimes a very useful abstraction because it tells us what would be the optimal policy, even if you cannot actually directly influence the aggregate. Okay. Now, once we have a welfare criterion in place, what the economic epidemiology can do is it can help us prescribe what is the optimal deployment or use of the tools we have available. Okay, and that happens through a fully fledged cost-benefit analysis. The cost-benefit analysis, I have no illusions that this is an easy exercise. But this is the kind of framework that will help us think through what the trade-offs are. So the cost-benefit analysis can help us answer the following types of questions. For example, how should the optimal lockdown policies be designed? Should we have for example, a gradual phasing in of measures and then phasing out over time, or should they be switched on and off depending on the basic rate of reproduction? So this is a question that is a very practical question that we would like to understand better. Should we ramp up test and trace and isolate, or should we rely on social distancing? What is the best deployment of those different tools at different stages of the epidemic? Another question that has been brought up recently, especially in Scotland, is the so-called zero COVID approach. Should we attempt to reach a zero COVID approach, or should we just try to stem the tide as best we can until vaccines arrive? Again, this has been a very controversial thing, and doing a proper worked out cost-benefit analysis can tell us what are those things, what are the policies that we should be pursuing, rather than tying our colors to the mast with one specific policy and then work backwards and see how we implement it. Let the model itself tell us what is the best way to do things. The second thing we can do, apart from designing optimal policies, is to explicitly consider incentives and individuals' reactions to policy, and therefore how different policies are going to be met by the population and how they're going to change behavior. And the reason we can do that is that the incentives and the decision-making is baked into the model itself, okay? And so we can basically we can trace what are the consequences of different policies on behavior and therefore on outcomes. So we can ask, for example, what were to happen if we don't lock down the economy? Is spontaneous behavior going to go some way towards controlling the disease if we were to do nothing? In other words, we want to basically revisit the question of what is the realistic worst case scenario. We can ask questions like, should we pay people to self-isolate? Would it make sense to actually give them financial incentives to self-isolate? Or, for example, might there be a good case for increasing statutory sick pay? Okay. Third, will people do as they're told? So just because we have designed what would seem to be an optimal policy, if we were to inform the population that this is the optimal policy, can we trust that they will actually play along, and do they have the right incentives to do what is optimal? Okay, and typically that will of course not be the case. And last, we can ask much more complicated questions. For example, like, should we provide real-time disease statistics? How does releasing information to the population, how does that influence people's decisions, and how does that help or hinder our ability to manage the disease? Okay. So this is all a little bit abstract. So I'm going to now show you a kind of an illustration of a very simple SIR type model, which is the kind of model, a simplified version of the kind of model that the Imperial College Group looked at. These particular simulations are going to be based on a paper that I wrote with Miltos Magris, but it is a very, very simple model of social distancing, which can be reduced through voluntary or mandated actions. The basic trade-off of the model is very simple, which is that social distancing is costly. People don't want to engage in it unless they have to, but they might have to because it reduces the chances of becoming infected with a disease like COVID, which is unpleasant for most and dangerous even for some. Okay, but very similar types of analyses can be found in the literature. Eli Fenichel has a paper many years ago, and so does Tim Reluga, that looks very much at this type of model. So I'm going to not go through the mathematics of it because I think I cannot do it justice, but just to show you what is going on, this is schematically what the model looks like. People are either susceptible, infected, and recovered, and once they're recovered, they can't be reinfected. In this particular version, people don't die, but this is easily included as well. Now, the thing is that people can basically, at a cost, reduce the rate at which they go from susceptible to infected. And that's what social distancing does. And so what we do is we look at two different scenarios, one in which the individuals do what they want themselves without being directed to do anything. So it's basically, it's decentralized, it's non-cooperative, so people decide on their own. It's completely voluntary and spontaneous, okay? And we're going to look at what is the path of infection in such a world. And we're going to compare that to two different benchmarks. We're going to compare it first with the so-called non-behavioral model, that is the basic model, but without any behavior. So that's your classical epidemiological model. And we are then also going to compare it with the social distancing that a benevolent social planner would choose in this same model. Okay, so I'm going to show you, rather than to work through the model, it's available in the paper. I'm going to show you basically the results in terms of graphs. So here I've plotted three curves over time. So on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have number of infected people. The benchmark case is the black curve, and the black curve is the one that corresponds to the purely biological, non-behavioral model. And just let me just take you through it. It has a very well-known pattern of infection from this type of model. Initially, very few people are infected, and therefore the number of new infections is moderate. Over time, of course, there's going to be more and more infected people, and at some point there's a takeoff phase where infections basically explode and grow exponentially. Okay, at some point though, there will have been enough people to recover and to leave the set of susceptibles, so that infection peaks at some point, and then over time, herd immunity gradually sets in, and the number of infection basically tapers off. Okay, so that's the do nothing benchmark that the Imperial College Group basically showed us in their report. With that, let's contrast now the path under equilibrium. So equilibrium is the setting where individuals in a non-coordinated manner are just left to their own devices, protect themselves when they find it personally optimal to do so. Now, under this scenario, the curve you can see has the same overall shape as it has in the non-behavioral model, but importantly, it peaks at a much lower level than does the non-behavioral model. And the reason is that in this model, individuals have an incentive to self-protect. And so that already shows us that the so-called reasonable worst case scenario is perhaps not so reasonable after all. Okay. And the last thing I just want to emphasize, and I will go back to this in a few slides, is that the red curve, which is what the benevolent social planner would do, induces even less infection than would happen in equilibrium. So basically, so the takeaway point from this graph is that what will happen in equilibrium if we don't do anything is going to be somewhere between what would happen in a purely non-behavioral model and what would happen if the social planner could dictate and impose a specific pattern of social distancing. So what are the three main takeaways from this analysis? Okay, by the way, these insights are extremely general. They don't just hold in this particular setting, but the way that these insights are reflected, of course, will depend on the details of the model at hand. So let me tell you what I think are the main takeaways from this analysis. The first one I've touched upon already. People have incentives to self-protect. As we saw in the case of the Swedish mobility data, even if they were not necessarily forced to socially distance, they found it in their own personal self-interest to do so. So people actually change behavior when risks change. We now know this with a lot of confidence because of a lot of recent empirical work. As the epidemic worsens, people increase social distancing. This in turn will attenuate the epidemic. Okay, it will curb additional infections, and therefore the non-behavioral path is not a reasonable worst case scenario. It's actually much too pessimistic. The realistic worst case scenario is actually not as bad as the Imperial College study would have us believe. The second main takeaway from this analysis is that people protect themselves too little. So we saw that in the graph because the socially optimal curve, the red curve, was below the curve, the blue curve, which was the equilibrium one. So why do people protect themselves too little? Well, the idea is very simple. It's one that is well known to economists, and that's the idea of uninternalized externalities. So externalities are basically the effects that individuals' decisions have on third parties. A classical externality, of course, is herd immunity. Herd immunity is a very nice example of an externality. And so the insight here is simply that individuals, when they make decisions about protecting themselves, they don't necessarily take into account all the benefits to third parties or to the population at large that flow from those self-protection decisions. And therefore, they will tend to do too little and too late from a social perspective. The planner would like there to be more social distancing and for it to happen earlier. Of course, this is a margin through which the social planner may be able to change policy, to change behavior towards better outcomes through different incentive schemes, rewards, and fines, and what have you. And the last thing, the last takeaway from this analysis is that in order to do proper cost-benefit analysis, it is vital to choose the right benchmark. So a cost-benefit analysis in a nutshell is as follows. Suppose you want to build a new bridge. In order to figure out whether it's worthwhile to build that bridge, you want to calculate what is the value of not doing it versus what is the value of doing it. Now, in the instance of the bridge, of course, the the benchmark against which we are comparing the value of the bridge is to do nothing, which is basically to go on as usual. Now, the problem with doing the same kind of analysis in epidemic settings is that the benchmark scenario of doing nothing itself changes over time. It's a dynamic thing, and it is better than the world that we inhabited before the epidemic was there in the first place. Okay, and so that means that if you don't get the benchmark right, then you can come to wrong conclusions. And I'll give you a few examples of that on the next slide. The right counterfactual, that is the right benchmark scenario that we need to do in order to value or evaluate the desirability of a lockdown measure, for example, must be what would happen if we were to do nothing. And as we have seen, the do nothing scenario is not the purely biological model. It must be the one where people voluntarily change behavior. So the equilibrium disease path is the right benchmark. It is emphatically not the non-behavioral disease path, but by the same token, it is also not the pre-epidemic path that is the world we inhabited before the advent of the disease. So let me give you just an outline of some different pitfalls that we've seen in the media and in policy debates over the last year. People would say something like, if we don't do anything, more than 500,000 people will die in the UK. So people have said things to that effect. The problem, of course, with that kind of thing is that it ignores behavior. Spontaneous social distancing will mean that people are going to self-protect to some extent, and so the biological non-behavioral model does not give us the right benchmark here. Second, we've seen things like GDP has dropped by 1/3 since COVID-19 started. Lockdowns are destroying the economy. Okay. Now, what the problem with this statement is, of course, is that it both ignores behavior, but it also uses the wrong benchmark. So, for example, if we find that GDP is down on the level that it was before the crisis even started, of course, we're not making a fair comparison. What we want to do is we want to see how much of the reduction in economic activity can we assign to the policies, and how much of it can be assigned to spontaneous behavior. And recent empirical evidence shows that actually more than half, and at least in most of the studies that have been distributed and published, more than half of the disruptions are caused by behavior, not by policies themselves. Okay, so using the wrong benchmark at the same time, it overstates the number of lives saved by intervening, because it uses the wrong benchmark, but also it overstates the economic disruption of mandated social distancing measures. Okay, and the last thing that we also hear is, especially from people who are against social mobility restrictions, they will say something like, people know what the risks are, they're not stupid, they're already protecting themselves, and there's no need for lockdowns, because we shouldn't be telling people what to do if they already know what's right to do. Okay, and this argument, of course, completely ignores the presence of externalities. Yes, I may know what the risks involved are. Yes, I may know when it's right for me to protect myself, but my preferences are not necessarily aligned with those of society at large. And so even if I recognize the risks, I may not take those into account, and therefore I'm not internalizing the externalities of my decisions, and therefore we may not be able to rely on voluntary behavior to achieve the socially optimal outcomes. Okay. Now, the problem with this kind of statements and this kind of thinking is that they are very commonplace, and they actually dictate policy. You know, when large parts of the population think like this, politicians pay attention, and they might therefore change their behavior accordingly, and policies. Okay. Now, viewed through the economic analysis, it's clear why these statements are misleading and why these should not actually dictate policy. Let me finish by extending an invitation to people who are not economists, but who are working in this field, economists have shown an unprecedented eagerness to work in this field. Maybe not so much until a year and a half ago, but that's certainly no longer the case. There are literally thousands of economists working now on different aspects of disease control. Economists have a unique set of tools that may inform disease modeling, and they also have extensive evidence, not just in policy formulation, but also in empirical analysis and econometric analysis that can be brought to bear on epidemiological studies that might be of use for other people looking at these things. I have myself engaged in more than one project with epidemiologists, and I have found it incredibly rewarding and a great opportunity to actually learn things that I didn't know about epidemiology. So we need people on the other side, that is to say people who are in disease modeling, but not from the economics perspective, people who are in the behavioral sciences, who are working with these issues, and of course, people who are working with actual health policy formulation and public health researchers. So we need people to talk to, and I hope that this kind of event can be at least some vehicle for these kind of interactions to take place. Now, collaborative research can do two things, I think. First of all, it can give us a richer set of models that can help us improve prediction. So by fully incorporating behavior into models, and building on that, of course, we hope that this kind of models can be better to formulate policies and to contain epidemic outbreaks, and by doing so, achieve the twin aims of both having better health outcomes and better economic outcomes. So let me just finish with a quote by Gersowitz and Hammer from 2004. They wrote a paper that has been very influential in the economic epidemiology literature. They wrote this in 2004, but it's as relevant today as it was then. The economic approach to infectious diseases is in its infancy, somewhat oddly, because many economists have long had the intuition that epidemics and infectious diseases are quintessential manifestations of the principle of an externality, itself a central concept in economics, and they continue. Furthermore, epidemiology provides ready-made dynamic models of disease transmission, and economics provides methods for valuing the costs and benefits of health interventions and methods of dynamic optimization to guide policy. Policy towards infections is of great importance, yet only recently have economists begun to look at these questions in a formal way. So I would like to end on that note. I look forward to discussing these issues further with you at the sessions, and I am particularly excited to hear what other people have to say in this very interesting conference. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. See you soon.